It's hysterical. I don't know why they have to tell us recordings in progress. Anyway,
I think
hello,
it's
Micheal
a legal
Stanley.
requirement these days.
Oh, is it? Oh, the laws and whatnot.
Privacy.
Privacy. What? You gave up your right to privacy when you joined Facebook. That much I can tell you now.
That's true as well.
Yeah. Gentlemen, welcome to Life in a Garden Online. Thank you for joining us this evening. Anybody else who's watching, thank you for joining us this evening. This is a strange interview, but we've talked before, so it's not like I'm talking to strangers, is it?
No.
No, not at all. We've been with Mandi since the first book, I think, and it's a pleasure to be here with this book, and welcome to everybody who's joined.
Guys, I want to ask you, you're well into the Kubu books. Why did you suddenly decide to go back 30 years or something? And it is approximately 30 years, isn't it?
It is.
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I think there are two ways of answering that question. The one was we were interested in what Kubu's backstory was that hadn't come out as yet in the series of books. There are references to his school days, and there are references to his past in the CID, but very, very little. So it's really more from his school to where he is as the star detective in the Botswana CID. And there was this gap there that we felt it would be very interesting to bridge. In a sense, there was a gap in his character, and we thought that by bridging that, by filling it in with, of course, a story, we would round out his character more and develop him more, make him perhaps a more interesting character.
Stan, was it difficult?
Part of the reason, Mandi, is that he was never meant to be the main character. When we started, we were told to write what we knew. And so in our first book, A Carrion Death, in the first chapter, there is a professor of ecology. And since both Micheal and I were professors, Professor Bongani Sibisi was going to be the main character, because you write what you know. And when they found the body in that first chapter, they realized it wasn't an accident, it was a murder. And so they had to call a policeman. So we got this detective driving into the Kalahari from Gaborone in his old Land Rover with sandwiches and something to drink and a cassette tape to which he could sing rather badly his operatic arias. So we had never planned for him. So we hadn't actually thought about him really as a young man. So we needed to do that, go back and fill in those gaps, as Micheal said.
Was it hard writing 30 years in the past in terms of forensics and cell phones and fax machines and things like that?
Yes,
I think it was actually harder in a different way. Those things, of course, you have to pay close attention to, but you also have to pay very close attention to ensure that everything that happens in the prequel doesn't upset something in one of the later books. He can't do something that's referred to differently later. You don't want to set something later up. So we had to really think about all the subsequent books, if you like, to make sure we didn't screw up.
Sorry. So things like
I think in terms of the actual writing in the past, it's not, although as you say it's 30 years, it's not that far that it's really a historical novel, if you like, that you have to, we did have to do quite a bit of research and see what was around in those days. And the diamond mine, of course, was very different, and the technology was very different. But really the main thing I think that we had to worry about was the sort of things that we do just every day by second nature. You want to know something, you look it up on Google. That was sort of pre-Google search engine days. And cell phones had just started making an appearance in Botswana, and a policeman, especially a new policeman, wouldn't have access to that sort of technology. But actually, not having cell phones is a big help for a mystery writer. Cell phones are a real problem in terms of too much communication, it's too easy to track people. The absence of cell phones is actually a blessing to mystery writers, I think.
I think the thing that you also notice, I've noticed there was no classical music and there were no steelworks in this book.
That's true.
That you actually have to consciously leave them out.
I think we unconsciously left them out.
Oh, is that a test to see if your readers would notice that he hadn't refined his tastes as yet?
It has been.
There is some reference to his. Learning his joy of wine. It's much more recent there. He's graduated from university and he had a lecturer who
enjoyed a bit of a trouble
wine and so on. Yeah, so it's sort of the start is there, but yes, some of the other features we left out, and certainly it wasn't in the way of rushing out and buying a bottle of champagne to celebrate Joy's birthday or something. It's a glass of wine is going to set him back a significant portion of his salary.
Are you guys planning to do another book that's pre-Kubu at large, shall we say?
It's just about finished.
Aha! I thought there might be something else in the works. Anyway, let's talk about this book. We're talking about big industry being dominant in Botswana in terms of diamond mining. Do you feel that big industry is a little bit bossy and that needed to be highlighted? Michael, let me ask you this question.
I think that in particular, it was the diamond industry that we were talking about. And of course, that is key to the plot, because the big crime in the book, if you want to call it that, is the hijacking of a security vehicle which is transporting diamonds from Jwaneng Diamond Mine, which is a De Beers Botswana joint venture mine. It's actually the largest, richest diamond mine in the world, and so that was an important feature to bring the diamond mines in. But in terms of the industry itself, the diamond industry dominated Botswana at that time. And that's where, going back for 30 years, does change things a bit, because it's still a very large industry and a very important industry in Botswana, but it doesn't dominate it to the extent that it does now. And in the book, there's a lot of, doesn't quite get to the level of threat, but it's very clear that the leaders of the company, the diamond company, De Beers, have a lot of clout with the government and the police, and they expect their wishes to be followed. So there is friction, because of course the police don't like to be told what to do by people who are not in the hierarchy, and particularly by people who were largely foreign. Although it was a joint venture, it was essentially run by the De Beers company in South Africa.
The level of cooperation between the Bots police and the South African police, do you think that actually exists? I mean, they're very nice to each other in this book.
I think probably these days it is quite good. If you go back when the South African police were bombing the homes of anti-apartheid people in Gaborone and so on, I suspect there was no cooperation. But I think it's probably reasonable now.
Based on what I was reading, I estimated your book to be 1993 or thereabout. Am I in the ballpark?
Just a little bit. It's a little bit later than that. I think 98, 97, 98, something like that.
Everybody would have had cell phones by then, wouldn't they?
Not in Botswana.
Not in Botswana.
No. So that because they came in here in 1993, 94.
Yeah.
That must be a hell of a lot of work trying to like go back to see what we would, what was available in 94 as opposed to, or in 98 as opposed to what was available, now, and particularly South Africa, Botswana.
Yeah, there was some cell phone availability in Gaborone, but I think that was it at the time.
Well, I remember when I joined Anglo American, which was in 1997. One of the things that my boss told me is you must be on call all the time. I must be able to reach you at any time of the day or night. So you must get a cell phone. I didn't have one. So, I thought, all right, well, this comes with the territory. So I bought a brick. Remember these things? They were about this size, and you lugged them around, or you had them clipped onto your belt and they pulled your pants off. And so even in South Africa, 1997 was fairly early in the cell phone history.
I'm just trying to think back because I had trouble getting a cell phone. I have a very bad credit history even then. And I remember getting my cell phone before I sold the shop. So that must have been about 96 or so.
Yeah, that probably was the case.
I think I still have the same number.
It was slower in Botswana. It was slower in Botswana than it was here.
Did you research a whole lot about cash and transit heists and things for this?
You always research different parts of things like that. I mean, one of the things we actually had difficulty with the publisher's artist was getting him or her to actually create a cover in the American version of the book. On the cover, there is a cash and transit vehicle. And for the longest time, it ended up looking like a matchbox car, which didn't quite fit with the story itself and what happened in it. But yeah, you try to understand how people break into these vehicles. You try to understand the procedures that the companies have, the constant monitoring of where the vehicles are, what safety measures they put in place, what can the person inside do and not do, and so on. You need to do all of that to make sure that when it's written, it's both plausible and accurate.
Did you chat to Leo Pinard at all?
I don't know who Leo Pinard is. Michael may.
Don't you know who he is, Michael?
I think so, yes.
Leo Pinard is the cash and transit guy who was, I think they had cell phones on board and they were attacked, and he would do all this evasive driving, and they have these cameras that point directly at the two guys in the front of the vehicle. And he was like, he was literally this not very like big macho man sitting there driving and like evading the hijackers, and then he like does a turnaround and he goes straight for them. It was very exciting. You must Google it or look on YouTube.
No, I have seen that, but I didn't remember the name.
Yeah, no, he's South Africa's very own Chuck Norris, and he has a book coming out, by the way, how to avoid getting hijacked or something.
Okay.
Cool. So yeah, so I kind of like had visions of him, sort of how would he react in this situation, but essentially they didn't see it coming because it was, shall we say, an inside job.
Yeah,
they didn't have any chance in this one.
Yeah, that was very sad. I felt quite sorry for the transit people. How much research went into, because I found this quite fascinating, your witch doctor. So you've got a witch doctor and you've got comparable belief systems and fetishes between Botswana practices and Zulu practices. You kind of think at the back of your mind, if you don't know enough about it, that they are pretty similar, and yet there's a vast difference.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of similarity, of course, but they are different. We know somebody who's a specialist in this area. And as you know, our witch doctors go back right to our first book.
Yeah.
They're not in every book, of course, but witchcraft and witch doctors in various forms really run through the whole series. And of course, Deadly Harvest was entirely focused around witchcraft and the use of human body parts in these magic potions, these black magic potions. So I guess we first really had our attention drawn to it when the real director of the CID took us out one afternoon and drove us around as we were writing A Carrion Death, and he showed us the prison, and he showed us the CID, and he showed us all sorts of relevant places where you might buy drugs and so on in Gaborone. And then at a certain point, he sort of decided he liked us, and he was saying, "Well, what's your book about?" And we told him a little bit about what we'd written at that stage for A Carrion Death, because we hadn't even finished the book. We were very fortunate that he was so nice to us. These two South African men drive into Botswana and announce they're writing a fiction book about the Botswana CID. Anyway, he listened very nicely, and he said, "Oh, that sounds quite interesting, but you know what you should write about?" And then he told us the case, the real case that's mentioned in Deadly Harvest. And that really intrigued us, and we spent a lot of time after that finding out more about these practices. And they're not, of course, restricted to Botswana at all. They're practically the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, and even areas of South America and so on have these influences. So it's a very broad and really quite interesting area. And as I say, we were fortunate to find somebody who was a specialist in these fetishes and so on.
I think that there's witchcraft in North America, but it's just called something very different.
You do.
Don't go there, Stan.
Yeah.
Why do you focus on Botswana as opposed to South Africa? I mean, you're South African boys, so why not write about your home country?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. The sort of the impetus for the whole thing came about in the mid-1980s. I used to come back from the States where I was teaching during the Northern Hemisphere summers. And I would come back, see my family, and then rent a small plane and fill it with friends and so on. And off we would go bird watching and game watching in Botswana and Zimbabwe. And it was on one of those trips on the Savuti Plains of the Chobe National Park that we saw a pack of hyenas hunting and killing a wildebeest. And in 4 hours, the wildebeest had disappeared because the hyenas eat the bones as well as the flesh. And so Micheal and I, both being avid readers of mysteries, said if we ever needed to get rid of a body, obviously a good way would be to leave it out for hyenas, because then there wouldn't be any body for the police to try and sort out who did it. And so the first reason why we set them in Botswana is that because that's where we had the idea. And then the second reason is that putting a body in the back of a bakkie or something and leaving it out for hyenas is very easy in Botswana, but try doing it going into Kruger. It's, wouldn't quite work out that way because, the South African game parks are so well regulated that would be just very, very difficult to do. And there is actually, although we didn't think of it at the time, another good reason, which Micheal will tell you about.
Yeah, that's, as Stan says, it's a sort of retrospective reason. And that is that there are many, of course, excellent crime writers writing about South Africa, about South African police procedurals. But basically anything you write about South Africa currently is not overshadowed, but it's arisen from the tensions of the apartheid era. There's a sort of a focus, there's a sort of a shadow, if you like, that covers everything that happens within the police, the corruption, all these different factors that are very specific to South Africa. The advantage that we find with writing in Botswana is that we can actually write about Southern African issues which are not affected by that. For example, we've talked about the witch doctor one. Well, that could be set in South Africa, it's true. But then there's the one with the death of the mantis, which is around the Bushman people of the Kalahari, the war in Zimbabwe, many of the Chinese influence. It's not to say that these things are not important in South Africa. It's just to say that you can put them in a slightly broader, less restricted context. That's the way we could put it. But have to be quite honest, that's really looking back, that's really retrospective. We can see that we had a freedom perhaps that we would not have had if we had been writing books set in South Africa.
I think South Africa is destined to have apartheid hanging over its head for the rest of its life. I mean, I can't see the shadow of that ever going away at this point. What's corruption like in Botswana? I mean, is there, or do they deal with it?
I think I'm sure there's corruption everywhere, but it is relatively minor compared to a lot of other countries.
Like South Africa, where it's wholesale.
Like South Africa or some other countries I can think of.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, Botswana still has the death penalty and they hang people. Do you think that's a deterrent and it should be reintroduced into South Africa or not?
My own view is I don't think it is, and I don't think it should be.
Yeah. Now there's it. Interesting. What's your opinion, Mike?
I think, well, I'd agree with Stan in the answer to your question. I think it's an interesting point that you've made, that Botswana still has, in a sense, quite a conservative, traditional approach. The government is quite conservative, even though it's probably done more for the people than I stand correct to be corrected, but I would think certainly any country in sub-Saharan Africa that I can think of. Despite all the concerns around the diamond wealth, the company did insist on a the government did insist on a 50-50 joint venture, and most of that money got filtered back into social services and infrastructure development, which also goes to your question about corruption. Certain other countries we could mention, a lot of that money would not have got anywhere near the people. So there is perhaps it's a paternalistic approach that has its upsides and its downsides. The upsides is they really do care about the people. It's still a very tribal structure. There are still tribal courts. It's not necessary that any offense would be tried in the way in which we understand it in the West. It could be handled by the chief locally. So the traditional structure and culture, beliefs and conservatism, if you want to call it that, is still very strong in Botswana, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
Stan, you said you agree with the fact that we don't have the death penalty. Why are you anti-death penalty?
Oh,
see, it's still an interesting book talk, right? No, well, give me the abridged version.
But very simply, I don't think we have the right to take somebody else's life. I think that if you want to look from a purely pragmatic point of view, there have been so many mistakes made where innocent people have been hanged. I cannot believe that that's the right way to do, and I absolutely don't believe it's any deterrent. Most murder is done on the spur of the moment, usually in anger, and somebody doesn't refer to their little book to say whether what they're about to do is a hanging offense or not. They just do it.
But what about the burden on the taxpayer? I mean, why should Joe Public have to finance your life of luxury in a hard-ass jail?
And what about the emotional burden of killing somebody who was innocent?
Do you not think that with today's forensics,
no, I don't.
You don't?
Not at all. Not at all.
Worldwide?
No, I think there are many cases that have been proven of people who've been incarcerated for many, many years, who then as the technology moves on, and you get more value from it, and that's of course something that we have to keep up with. DNA testing has freed quite a number of people. We're not talking thousands, I should think, but certainly hundreds. And they can be freed. You can't give them back the years that they've lost, but at least they're not dead. But I think the strongest argument really is the one that Stan has put forward, and the States is very good about this because if you want to call it good, there's heterogeneity. There are states that have the death penalty and there are states that don't. And you can compare them statistically. There is no evidence to suggest that the death penalty has a deterrent effect. And beyond that, of course, even though, as you say, there's a burden on the taxpayer, there's also a burden on the taxpayer otherwise, because it just goes through one iteration of appeals and the next, and sometimes these people are on death row for 10 years. So I'm not sure that that's the answer. I'm not sure I'd buy the Iceland model either, which is, I think that, what is it, Stan? Nobody can be sentenced to more than 6 years or something?
12 years.
12 years for whatever they do. So, that...
So you can almost get away with murder.
Well, you can get away with murder if you're willing to trade it for 12 years at worst.
Especially if the money's waiting for you when you come out.
Yeah, most murders in Iceland are somebody beating up on a spouse.
Yeah.
Is that a big thing? I mean, is domestic abuse really bad?
Well, I mean, if you look at Iceland's murder statistics, I think it's over the last 10 years, it's about 1.9 murders per year. So we're not looking at a large number of murders, and almost all of those are at the domestic level, not bank robberies or heists or something like that.
I'm trying to visualize what 0.1 of a person who's alive looks like.
Yeah.
Exactly, like just a hand or something. Talk to the hand.
We have a lot of fun by comparing what we call sunshine noir, which is noir set in hot places like South Africa and Botswana, with Nordic noir. And one of the issues, as Stan's just pointed out, is they really have very few murders. They have far more murders in mystery stories than they do have in real life, which means, I suppose, that the authors have to be perhaps more imaginative than we do.
Or just really sick and twisted, and it's not coming out any other way.
Exactly. But if you think about it, I mean, here you are with a crime in the heat of passion. You're in your heated cabin out in the wilderness somewhere, and you've decided you're going to go and sneak up and kill somebody else in another cabin. Now you start off by having to get on your thermal underwear and your heavy overcoat and your mittens and your goggles and your skis. And by the time you've got all this done, have you not cooled off? And even if you do, by the time you get there, you're going to be completely occupied in keeping yourself warm, let alone in attacking somebody. So
then remember to leave the chestnut man behind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Stan, earlier on, you referred to the different covers of the books. Why is it necessary to have two different or more versions of the cover?
Well, the simple answer is that we have two different publishers. So if you just wait, I'll show you a big difference. Just hold on a second.
We won't go anywhere, we promise.
All right, so I'm going to show you two examples. This is actually not the final version of Facets of Death.
No, this is.
But you can, okay, so that's the final version of Facets of Death from our English publisher. And this is the final version of the American edition, totally different. And then we have this, This was our standalone thriller about rhino poaching out of the UK. And this was the one.
Oh, I love that. Shoot fast. That's brilliant.
So totally different. And so not only do we have no control over what the books look like, but we also have no control over what the books are called. And the American publisher didn't like Dead of Night, thought it was too flat for the power, if you like, of the book. And so we eventually suggested Shoot the Bastards, because that's what you hear often when poachers are caught in South Africa. Our English publisher went berserk.
Oh, you can't say that.
She really couldn't stand the title, and was very, very upset that the Americans would have a title that was so different. And that created quite a furor on Twitter, which we actually quite liked.
Well, any advertising is good advertising.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. So that's the way it is. It's different publishers. And, when we've had German, French, and Italian publishers, they all have different covers as well.
That's fascinating, because, you wonder, particularly with two different titles, you wonder how people would be reviewing the book and then suddenly but I've read this book, it didn't have this name before.
Well, we get occasional emails when somebody's bought the other title, having bought the original title already, and then found they're reading the same book.
Yeah, your fan base must get a little upset.
We've had some nasty emails saying we're trying to scam the world.
Oh.
Yeah, it's always our fault, of course.
Of course. Mike, you referred to the novel. I said detective, you said police procedural. Is there a difference?
Well, I think there is. Police procedural really means that the protagonist, if you like, or the main characters are going to be part of a police force, and there's going to be a procedural aspect about it. If the police are investigating, let's say, a murder, then there's a procedure that they're going to go through to do that. The forensics, the pathologist comes to the body, and so on. So there's and part of the fun of the book, if you like, is displaying how this procedure works, particularly if it's in a different country, even a different police force, but in our case, a different country. So there is an aspect of that, and there are certain limits that the police have to work within. A detective, you could have a detective in the private detective sense, and a PI, a private investigator, and they have a different sort of style altogether, those books, in the sense that the private investigator, first of all, has no authority, so he can't make anybody, or she can't make anybody talk to them. If they come across a body, then they should do nothing about it except call the police. And then, of course, in the stories, you'll find that they do, grab a clue or take a look at a cell phone or something like this.
Yes,
so the context
a little bit of
is very different. Yeah, the deductive part is probably in common between the two. The skilled detective, the Sherlock Holmes type private eye, if you like, or the Kubu, if we can put our character in that context, will make eventually deductions from what they know and what they've heard and what they've seen and what other people have displayed to them and so on, which leads them eventually to the answer to the mystery. So there's obviously a lot in common between the two, but I think there is that difference.
There seems to be quite a dichotomy between people who believe in witch doctors and people of the Christian faith. And yet we have Kubu, who kind of like is wary, but walks the middle path because of his father. Who wants to raise that issue?
Well, one can look at Christianity in saying that somebody rose from the dead. That's sort of witch doctory, isn't it? And
or fantasy.
Or fantasy. So we look at Christianity in a particular way because that's how most of us have been brought up or brought up around it. But if you look at it from a totally, different perspective, Christianity, as with many of the religions, are all a little strange if you try and compare them to, what we know every day. We are all susceptible to funny things like throwing salt over your shoulder if you spill it, and touching wood, and all of these little superstitions, and where does that come from? I think it all originally stems from puzzlement as to what is causing things in the world.
Like bless you, for instance.
Bless you, and so on. When you sneeze, the devil's coming out, and so you want to bless the person. So I think all of these things come from a concern that we are all ignorant to a large extent about what's going on around us. And so we try to minimize that worry by various types of superstition.
Mike?
I think to go back to what I said before about Botswana, and you mentioned Kubu specifically. Kubu, I think, starts off pretty negative about witch doctors. In Facets of Death, he's very dismissive. And it's only as time goes on in the book that he starts thinking there may be something in it, even if it's psychological manipulation, but even that perhaps he's not willing to accept initially. But just in general in Botswana, again, this very traditional approach in the Swana culture comes through in this area. Belief in witch doctors and Christianity at the same time, and ancestors for that matter, is not a problem at all. People fit these different things into their own particular world frame, and they have no difficulty with going to church on Sunday and being concerned about witch doctors on Monday, to the extent that in extreme cases somebody may be burnt as a witch,
as opposed to a necklacing.
Yeah.
Which is the South African way.
Whatever the particular system. I mean, that doesn't happen often, but people certainly are ostracized, and that may be simply because they've been very successful. And the feeling is that either they themselves are using witchcraft, or they've paid a powerful witch doctor to use witchcraft. And then you ask for, you pray to God on Sunday that he will punish this person for doing this. And I mean, if you think back, we talked about Christianity in the earlier days was certainly very concerned about witchcraft. It was very much there as a real thing. So the fact that this is still the case in other places is not really that surprising.
How unusual is it for a person, a man straight out of varsity, to be made a detective without going through the entire process of becoming a beat cop and then passing exams and climbing the ranks slowly?
I don't have any numbers, but it worked for us.
I would guess that in Botswana, given everything I've said about the traditional society and the way things work, I would suspect that the probability of it happening is pretty close to zero.
Okay, so you've written a book of fiction.
That's what makes Kubu so special, you see.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anybody in the room who hasn't read a Kubu book? I think probably Brett. Brett probably hasn't read a Kubu book. So let's talk about Kubu and his life, because his life certainly evolves. Let's talk about his parents. His parents are fantastic, and they really went to great lengths to get him educated and get him a bursary and things like that. But his mom sounds very sweet. What's their backstory?
Well, I think they're just very traditional in that sense. And I think that there are lots and lots of examples, probably everybody here knows of them, where poor families, not only Black, but of all races, etc., have so much belief in the power of education that they will go to great lengths to have their children get the best education they can. Sometimes they can't go far because they have very little. Sometimes they have a little influence, like Wilmon, Kubu's dad, with the local priest. But the belief in education, I think, is really widespread. And so I think that's very, very real in Botswana and many parts of the world.
Two privileged white men writing about a Black detective. Is that not cultural appropriation?
We were asked, Michael, you go ahead and I'll come in.
Yeah, we were asked to write a little op-ed piece about exactly this. I mean, this question does come up from time to time, but I think it's hard to answer. I think whenever you write fiction, you often you're appropriating something in your characters. If you have a man writing about a woman, that in a sense is a big jump. In many ways, I think it's a bigger jump than jumping across a racial line or a tribal line, if you want to put it that way. But we do it all the time. Fiction writers do it all the time. They have to. We are going to have characters who are men. We're going to have characters who are women. We're going to have characters from different races. They'll be from different backgrounds. I mean, how about, as you say, we've accurately that we're privileged white men. What about writing about poor white people? I think all one can really hope for or aim towards is to be careful that what you're writing is consistent with everything that you know about the character. The character's got to be real, and the character won't be real if you don't know about the background, as we've talked about background a lot this evening. And so, I mean, in our case, we spent a lot of time with Botswana men and women. We have had them read our material, not as much now recently, but certainly initially. We asked for friends to read it and give us comments on it, and we had lots of comments and we had lots of mistakes. All I can say in terms of the acceptance of what we've done within Botswana, our books do sell in Botswana, but there's not a large reading population certainly not of fiction anyway. So we sell some books, but not a huge number, and probably a lot of those are to tourists. There's a bookstore in Gaborone that sells them. But one of our books was chosen as the feature for a cultural festival in a town in Botswana, and I attended that, and they did play little short plays and recited poems all around Kubu and the story of that particular book, which was A Death in the Family. So that was a huge compliment, and we felt that it was a huge, shall we say, it was a huge amount of acceptance that the people there were happy to display our work, interpret our work in their own way. And the chief was there. Nobody obviously felt a concern about it. But I do think it's a real issue. I don't think it should be just brushed aside as nonsense. It's certainly a certainly important thing to think about. And I think sensitivity is the word that I would regard as paramount. Sensitivity to other people's beliefs and culture and mores. So hence the witch doctors, again, we've talked a lot about that. You know, we're not dismissive. We're not dismissive of it at all. And we know that whether it works or not, certainly not intending to try out anything of that nature, but the psychological impact certainly works, and the impact on the culture is huge. So to ignore it or to dismiss it would be, I think, very poor behavior.
Stan, you wanted to say something? Or did he cover it?
I think that people's imaginations should be allowed to work. You can think of famous writers like Shakespeare. I mean, is he not allowed to write about a merchant in Venice, or
exactly
a prince in Denmark, or a prince out of Africa? It's his imagination. To me, where the real issue comes down, and pretty much what Micheal said, is sensitivity, first of all. And secondly, if there is an intent to mislead, I think that is misappropriation. And that I don't think is good. I mean, for example, a friend of mine and I had a discussion at some length, and she's a very, very well-known, internationally known writer, about what I should call myself writing the one that I've just written solo, Wolfman, because the protagonist is a Vietnamese woman.
Interesting.
And so, you know, Kubu is a male from Botswana. Crystal Nguyen is both female and Vietnamese, neither of which I am.
Doesn't she feature in one of your books?
Yeah, she does.
She does.
In
Death in the Family.
She's the investigative journalist in Dead of Night. And then she is the protagonist in my Wolfman.
Oh, how fantastic.
And this friend of mine, Cara Black, who's really, really well-known writer, and I was saying, maybe I should write under the a Vietnamese nom de plume. Now, I didn't eventually, I was very tempted, but I think that is cultural misappropriation.
Yeah.
In terms of sensitivity, the Crystal Nguyen really in the books does not get on with her father, who is a traditional Vietnamese man, was an officer in the South Vietnamese army during the Vietnamese War. And he very much wants her to do what he tells her, that she should stay at home, not date anybody unless he's around and has given permission. Very, very paternalistic. And I've read a lot about Vietnamese families, particularly Vietnamese families in the United States, and that is really accurate. It's also true, and there is no negative part about this. A lot of people don't like it, but it just is true that Vietnamese are quite comfortable eating dogs. Like
I know, that frightens me.
Cows and this and that, they include dogs. The French eat horses. I mean, it's just a fact. And I had in an original draft in my book that when her father kicks her out of the house because he spotted her holding hands with an American boy.
Oh dear.
That he goes way beyond that and kills her dog.
Wow. Why did you take it out?
No, I kept killing the dog in, but I took out the next step.
Which is eating it.
Right. And I did that because I felt it was making a caricature out of the guy. Even though it was very plausible, I thought that it was a step too far in that he plays such a minor role. It didn't need that little piece to create his
Yeah, I would have made him larger than life there.
I think so, yeah.
You know, it's quite funny when I was interviewing Hamilton Wendy about Red Air. Those soldiers drop in with the dog. And the one thing I said to him in the interview was, why did you have to kill the dog? I think that's the thing that we tend to remember, you know. And also, who wrote? And Margie Orford, in one of her books, there's a dog that they never clarify what happened to the dog. And I've left wondering 10 years later, you know, like what happened to the dog? So at least, you know, you put your dog in a, you know, you finished it off. So we know what happened to the dog.
Well, certainly in the States, and I suspect it's true most places, if you're thinking of a white audience, you can kill as many people as you want, but don't kill the dog.
Right.
But the cat's a different story. I mean, how many movies and books do they kill the cat and nail it to the door or something? Okay, we're getting a little bit macabre here. So, guys, we are running out of time. So I'd like to ask you both to read us a little bit of Facets of Death.
Michael, you're going to kick off?
Yeah, I'll kick off if you like. So just because the whole point of the book really is to start with the day that Kubu actually joins the criminal investigation department. He's fresh out of university, and this is the job he's dreamt of for many, many years. So this is the first day that he joins the Botswana CID, and it is the first page, chapter 1 of Facets of Death. The early morning sun promised a scorcher of a day, and David Kubu Bengu's clothes were already damp with sweat, not unusual for a man of his size in a hot climate. He was standing in front of the Criminal Investigation Department on Queen's Road, excited and nervous about walking through the front door, excited because it was his first day as a detective in the Botswana police, nervous because he'd been hired to the position without having had any time as a constable on the beat. In fact, he'd never even been in uniform. He was expecting to take some heat for that. Kubu pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. He leant over and cleaned his shoes, which were covered in dust from his long walk to work. When he was satisfied, he took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. "Here goes," he said aloud, and strode towards the door. "I'll always remember the 30th of November, 1998, my first day at work." "Detective Sergeant Bengu reporting for work," he told the man at reception, who looked him up and down with a frown. "Bengu?" The man shuffled through a stack of papers. "Bengu." A few moments later, he found what he was looking for. "David Bengu?" "Yes, but everyone calls me Kubu." The man snorted, taking in Kubu's bulk. "I can see why." Kubu didn't react. He was used to that sort of response. After all, he'd had the nickname for over 5 years, ever since he first met Angus Hofmeyer, a rich white boy at Maruapula School. "You're David?" Angus had exclaimed in disbelief when they first met. "David Bengu? That's not right. You aren't a David, not even a Goliath. You're a Kubu. That's what you are, a big friendly hippopotamus." Kubu remembered being upset at first, but he had come to like the special familiarity of the name. The other kids had laughed, of course, but soon Kubu was his name. Now he was sure that some of his friends didn't even know his real name. Miffed that his snide comment had failed to raise even one of Kubu's eyebrows, the receptionist ordered Kubu to go immediately to Assistant Superintendent Mabaku's office. "He's going to be your boss. I don't envy you because he eats nails."
"Sit down. I'll be with you in a minute." Mabaku waved at one of the chairs in front of his desk. Kubu lowered himself, carefully supporting some of his weight with his legs until he was sure the chair wouldn't collapse. He waited patiently while Mabaku growled at a letter he was reading. Mabaku's office was small and very hot. The window air conditioner was on, judging by the strange noises, but very little cool air was being pushed into the room. There were stacks of files on every horizontal surface, and on top of one filing cabinet was a color photo of a woman whom Kubu took to be Mbaku's wife. Eventually, Mbaku looked up and glared at Kubu. He shook the letter in the air. "It's your fault. The director wants me to file all the paperwork so that you get paid, that you have health insurance, and that you start contributing towards your pension. I thought that's why we have secretaries to do all the tough work." Kubu didn't respond. "Do you have a driver's license?" "Yes, sir." "And a car?" Kubu nodded and smiled. "An old Land Rover, sir." He was still amazed that he'd been able to buy it. It was mainly due to the generosity of one of his lecturers at the university who had wanted to sell it and told him to pay it off when he could afford to. At his police salary, it wasn't going to be paid off anytime soon. Mbaku glanced up, surprised. "How old?" The smile vanished. Quite old, sir." Mbaku picked up a sheet of paper and handed it to Kubu. "Fill this out and take it to Miriam, the director's assistant. It authorizes you to take a car from the pool if you need one. Use one of them for business rather than your Land Rover. There are usually 2 or 3 pool cars at the back of the building. Check they haven't been reserved, though, before you take one." He scratched his head. "I'm sure I've missed something, but it'll come to me, probably at an inconvenient moment." There was a long silence, something that Kubu was good at maintaining. "Do you fit into your office?" Mbaku asked at last. "I'm sorry it's so small, but it's the only one we've got. Had they stocked it with pens, notebooks, the usual forms, and so on?" "Nobody's shown me my office, sir." "God damn it." Mbaku pounded on the top of his desk. "That Elias at reception is always trying to cause trouble for you." "I don't understand." "It's my fault. I just hope it doesn't become too much of a problem for you." Kubu frowned. "You impressed the right people at the university. They persuaded me you'd be wasted spending several years in uniform on the beat. So we took a chance and hired you as soon as you graduated. We've never done that before. Just ignore Elias and the others like him. That's my advice. They're just jealous." Annie, should I stop or go on?
I don't know. Should he stop or go on? I'm quite enjoying hearing it out of your mouth, particularly when you start banging the table.
Okay. I was expecting something like that, Kubu shrugged. Mbaku looked through the papers on his desk. "I think that's all for now. Any questions?" "Yes, sir. What's my first job? I'm keen to get to work." "We meet every Monday in the room at the end of the passage. We're meeting in 15 minutes, in fact. We'll find out then what's happened over the weekend. That's all. Go and tell Elias that he's got to show you your office and make sure you have the supplies you need." With that, Mbaku lifted a file from one of his stacks, opened it, and started reading. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Kubu heaved himself out of his chair. He closed the door quietly as he left the room and walked back to reception. "What do you want now?" Elias asked. "Assistant Superintendent Mbaku would like you to show me to my office and to make sure I have all the supplies I need. I'm busy right now." "The Assistant Superintendent wants me to be settled in my office before the staff meeting in 15 minutes, Kubu responded, stretching the truth a little. "But if you are too busy, I'll go and ask him who can help me." Elias glared at Kubu, knowing he had lost the round. "Follow me," he barked. As they walked down the corridor, Kubu made a mental note to double-check anything Elias did for him. He was sure Elias would try and even the score. "That's your office." Elias pointed to a door. "I'll bring the stuff you need in a few minutes." "Thank you for your help." Kubu wasn't quite able to keep the sarcasm from his tone. Sure enough, Elias walked into Kubu's office a few minutes later with a box full of supplies. Again, Kubu thanked him, but Elias just glowered. With only a few minutes left, Kubu grabbed a notebook and pencil from the box and headed to the meeting room, where director Tebogo Khobi would preside. At last, Kubu thought. He was about to start doing what he'd wanted to do for such a long time, be a detective.
Love it. Well done, boys. That was fabulous. Who plays Kubu in the movie? Because it's not Denzel Washington, it's not Idris Elba. I have visions
Forrest
of like
Whitaker.
Forrest Whitaker. I don't like him. No, I don't like him. I mean, I know he fits the profile, but I really don't like him.
There are actually quite a few actors in Britain who would do very well, whose names I'm blanking on, actually. But that would be terrific, wouldn't it?
It would be amazing.
I would accept Forrest Whitaker.
Yeah, no, I don't know. There's something about him I don't like. I find him very unsettling. Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who joined us, and anybody who didn't really missed out. And Stan, I really want to read your book. Hint, hint.
Okay. I'll be in South Africa in 2 months.
You're in Denmark. I think that's so exciting. What's the weather like?
It's Danish weather. It's raining.
We wish it would rain here. We wish it would rain here. Thank you both very much.
It's quite warm. It's 15 degrees and overcast and drizzling.
Oh, that sounds horrible. I don't mind the cold, but I won't do the wet and the cold at the same time. You can have the one or the other. But anyway, gentlemen, as I said, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you for joining us. And everything of the best with your book, gentlemen. I absolutely loved reading it. And I do recommend that everybody reads all the others and this one. And I can't wait for the next one. Bye, guys. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Mandi. Thanks very much for the interview.
Always a pleasure.